Hello, everybody, and welcome back. It's been so long, I've missed you.
I somehow remembered to put on all the exact same jewelry. Can you believe it?
And I'm wearing the same cheap Costco sweater that I was. We prepared for you. It definitely hasn't been like 2.5 minutes since we recorded last week's episode. I am, as usual, Pastor Don. You still haven't gotten rid of me. And joining me is the one, the only, the magnificent, the amazing, the various other superlatives, Courtney Fraley.
Courtney. Yeah, it's me.
So today, Courtney, are you ready? Have you prepared yourself?
Yeah, much as I can.
Because what we have for us today is Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 19, entitled in the NRSVUE at least, the command to sacrifice Isaac. We have for ourselves one of the most hotly debated, often confused, generally upsetting passages in the story of Abraham. And unlike a lot of the other ones, like Abraham continually selling his wife as a human trafficker, this one we talk about. Like, this is one that we do wrestle with in church, some churches, maybe not all churches, but we do wrestle with from time to time. So it's at least one that I think most of us will know a little bit. So, are we ready to dig in?
No time like the present. Let's hit it. You want to read this one?
I suppose I can, since you read the last one. Here we go. Genesis chapter 22. For those of you playing the home game, by the way, I'm reading along in the NRSVUE version, which I highly recommend. If you don't have it, read whatever's handy. Read whatever's handy. You may find some interesting stuff. Genesis chapter 22, command to sacrifice Isaac. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham! And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father! And he said, here I am, my son. He said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar atop the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham! And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, and by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Questions?
The easiest question is why is God fucking with them this way?
Fair question. As a side note, before I address this, I'm going to throw this out here. The continual phrasing of your son, your only son, kind of makes me like sympathetically pissed off for Ishmael a little bit. So, just going to throw that out there, but that's a different discussion. Your question of why. I'm going to answer your question with another question because I'm Irish and that's just how we do things. Well, half Irish. Anyway, I want to ask you, who's being tested here?
I've been to enough college classes to understand that that question's being asked for a reason. Well,
Yeah.
the text would seem to indicate that the test that is being done is that God is testing Abraham to see how far he will go to serve him.
Okay. That is the context in which it has been placed, yes.
But you're asking that question makes me think that there's a possibility that somehow here Abraham is testing God. Like, okay, I'm going to go do this.
Actually,
Tell me to do it. I'm really going to go do it.
like that, there is
he'll
that
provide it.
dynamic there. But I want to call your attention to what is generally referred to as the hardest working piece of punctuation in the Bible. Verse 8, Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. Now, you see that comma between offering and my son.
Yes.
Here's something that'll blow your mind. Ancient Hebrew doesn't have punctuation.
Okay.
It also doesn't have periods. It is often assumed by scholars that that sentence may be two sentences. Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, period. My son, period. That is also considered a legitimate interpretation of that response to Isaac. And that changes absolutely everything about the entire understanding of the verse, because suddenly it goes from Isaac as an object to Isaac as an active participant, having chosen to lay himself up as a sacrifice because he knows it is what God has asked. Because
it goes into a lot of detail, and he talks about him binding his hands and feet and stuff like that. Like, it doesn't say anything about whether it was did he allow this to happen? Did he allow him to bind his hands and feet? Did he fight it? There's important bits missing here, it feels like.
Yeah, and as anyone who's ever had to apply any kind of discipline to a child over the age of 1.5 knows, like, if you wanted to actually bind a kid hand and foot, like, that is not going to be an easy task in the best of circumstances.
It's hard enough to get a t-shirt on them if they don't want to.
Yeah. So, like, if the kid asks, where's the animal sacrifice? And you just start binding them hand and foot, that kid's going to start freaking out. Like, I don't know that it's physically possible for old man Abraham to have accomplished that without Isaac's participation.
How old was Isaac at this point?
Old enough to have conversations of a reasonable accuracy with his father.
That's a large, long age range.
I mean,
that's like 4 or older. Like,
which, again, I mean, we're post circumcision. He's definitely not a baby. He's old enough to have conversations, like legitimate conversations. And I should specify, as someone with somewhat older children, there is a window between able to speak and able to hold meaningful conversation.
Yeah.
And he's past that point, which would indicate to me an age of at least 7 to 9.
Well, and he's big enough to carry wood.
Yeah.
Too.
So probably bigger still.
I'm just wondering if there's any possibility that we had angsty 15-year-old Isaac just realizing he's going to be a sacrifice and just being like, that's a metal way to go out.
Yeah. I'm just imagining, Isaac, God says I got to burn you alive. And Isaac's like, yeet. Just goes. Like, no, I mean, but that does change what we're talking about, because then the whole thing is placed in the context of Abraham and his line of descendants. Abraham's been tested and honestly found wanting periodically throughout this whole story to this point. Another test like this seems excessive, unnecessary even, but a test for Isaac.
And risky given his track record.
Right. Very risky. But if this is directed at Abraham, but focused on Isaac, what we have here is, look, we already tried to make an offspring once with Ishmael. Because of Sarah, that shit didn't work. So we've got one through you. Now we've got to test that line, see if that's going to be stable enough to build on. That's what it seems like to me. Is it the best way to do that? I don't know. I'm not God. Human sacrifice. I'm not going to say that's a great choice, but that is within the context of the time what was chosen. And it seems like it's directed at Isaac to see if Isaac is capable of yielding to God and making it happen. So that's the first major take that I have on this, but I'm sure you have other questions here.
Yes. Is the lesson of this story really meant to be, if God is telling you to do something that you know is morally wrong, you should do it anyway? Because that's going to create some problems. I can just say from experience. People saying, oh, God told me to do this. Did he?
There's a reason why one-to-one conversations with God that are provable and direct happened in an era before camera phones. There is a difference between God said and I think the voices in my head that are telling me to do stupid things are God. Like, there is a noticeable difference to that. The lesson of this text, I don't think, is if God tells you, do whatever. Because that is, I'll admit, a dangerous lesson to have out there, because in an era where God does not step down off the mountain and give direct one-to-one instruction, that becomes an entirely ephemeral personal belief. Like, what God tells me is what different from what God tells you.
And it allows charlatans to simply say that,
God told me I need a private plane.
God told me this is his will, so this is what we have to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Also known as the Kenneth Copeland methodology. God told me I need a private plane because flying coach with you all makes it hard for me to pray. That is a legitimate thing that this guy actually said. Side note. Anyway, so like, that is not the lesson here. And it's worth remembering that the quote unquote lesson we're being given from a lot of biblical passages, the idea of even a lesson coming from it is a latter kind of narrative construction. These stories were meant to be not necessarily historical, but they were meant to lay down the evolution of the relationship. What I see here when I look at this story is there is something that is happening in communication between Abraham, Isaac, and God. Abraham does not seem to be understanding it, but within the context that he has, which is, okay, in order to communicate with God, I got to strap some shit down and burn it. Isaac seems to be willing to yield to his father's interpretation because, well, his father is the one who's teaching him these things, but also doesn't seem to have much agency beyond that. So he's willing to go really either way. Is God giving the command to do that, or is what we have in verse 2 mediated by human hands? Are we getting, is this what God said, or is this what Abraham thinks God said? I don't know.
Well, and we've got a track record in your interpretation of Abraham doing stuff that he thinks is what God wants, but it's just like him doing it the humaniest way possible.
Right.
Like, oh, all this is ours, so I should go conquer this, right? No, you don't have to. Okay, well, you did that now, so like.
Now, let's go a step further and consider the oral way in which these stories were passed down. These were passed down father to son, community to community over time. So in verse 2, Abraham, here I am, I'm right here, Lord. And you have this exchange in private between Abraham and God. But then we get a similar exchange between Abraham and Isaac that mirrors linguistically that same conversation between Abraham and God. And then, and this is key, when God is revealed to stop the sacrifice, it's something different. Abraham's communication with God is the same as Abraham's communication with Isaac. But when God actually extends into the world to communicate, it's via an angel, a messenger. So we are seeing a structural kind of fundamental difference between what Abraham is experiencing when the angel comes down to stop the sacrifice, and what Abraham is experiencing in private when he's told to go do the sacrifice, which does not outright tell me these are different things, but does suggest that Abraham's mindset may play a part in how this is being understood.
Seriously.
Yeah, because God does not have a habit of just, at
Asking you to
least
kill
not since
children.
Eden, just popping down and saying, yo, man, what's up? You're going to have to go stab your kid. That's not how it goes. Like
Your only kid who I made a pretty big deal of.
Yeah. So we're being presented with something that is counterintuitive, that goes against what God's been laying out so far, which, you know, may well be part of the test, but also the way in which it's delivered is counter to the way in which God interacts throughout the entire rest of the story. God interacts via messenger, via angel. God doesn't one-to-one. It's rare to see God one-to-one a guy at the beginning of the story and then refuse to talk to him but by relay later on. That is unusual. I'm not saying it's unheard of, but it is definitely unusual. And it does bespeak to a functional, like, material difference between the communication at the beginning and the communication at the end.
Okay. Something is that was I was trying to kind of hold it onto with my brain while you were talking there.
Mhm.
DD is a trip sometimes. I remember in church hearing, you know, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. You can argue that, I think it could be argued that this is one of those sorts of cases too,
Mhm.
where it's like, oh, well, clearly, you know, his birth was a miracle to begin with. The
Yeah.
Lord gives something to you, he can take it back if he wants to.
Mhm.
My problem with those sorts of interpretations is I don't want to worship a God who's a dick. Like,
Yeah, I'm with you. And there is the
like
interamelioration.
that's villain behavior. That is villain behavior.
And this stems from this very human desire we have to want to see God as the ultimate chess master, kind of manipulating every piece on the stage and authoring specifically every event that happens so that we don't have to take responsibility for our part in the story. And looking at this as a, well, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, is an easy way to remove Abraham's miscommunication, Abraham's misunderstanding, Abraham's just general stupidity from the story. To make it Abraham's divine, Isaac's divine, everybody's good. God's just testing them. It's okay. That's how God works. It's confusing, it's weird, and sometimes brutal, but that's not how God works. And the difference between how God speaks at the beginning and how God speaks at the end gives us an indication that, well, maybe this was a case of Abraham dramatically misunderstanding what God was asking him to do and trying to roll through with it, and God stepping in at the last moment, as God does. We talked about this with Hagar and Ishmael and the time traveler child dilemma that I mentioned back then. With, you know, right up until the last moment, God's giving every possible chance for you to do the right thing. And when you've got the knife raised and it's clear that you're not, that's where the angel comes in. Whoa, dude, stop.
You can't actually do this.
Yeah,
It will mess everything up.
exactly. And I think a lot of that's what we're getting here. You know, the Lord doesn't micromanage every single action that happens on earth. That is, I really think, a misnomer that we've got to shake from ourselves. Is God allows free will to exist, and in so doing, that allows for things to go well and to go bad. And we've talked about, even back to the beginning when we talked about original sin and sin in general, we talked about the temporal steamroll of sin that may not be connected to you. Lowercase s as our individual sins, capital S sin as the force that is rampant, rolling down time like a snowball avalanche of mistakes that have caused other problems in the world. You know, the butterfly effect through time. both of these things are here and are present, and mistakes happen. They are allowed to happen because they are an artifact of free will, which is fundamental to how God wants to interact with us. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, but that does mean that it is a thing. And we can't look at events like this and say, well, clearly God was all up for the child murder. No, that was probably an amelioration or an interpolation by Abraham, more likely. Which we'll see again and again and again throughout the Bible. God says, and people interpret, and that interpretation usually means stabbity death. So that's my take on it. Anyway, like there are countless theologians throughout the ages who would disagree with me loudly and potentially with fisticuffs over that particular interpretation. And they wouldn't necessarily be wrong. Like there's a lot of theological scholarship on multiple perspectives regarding this, and I'm not even doing all of that justice with what I'm saying.
So a big take home here is there are a lot of potential takeaways from this, and it is still very much down to debate.
Yeah. And I would say there's a lot of ways to be right about understanding this, but the one way you can be definitely sure you're wrong is if you sit down to it and say, I know what this means. In general, I'm going to bring this back, and I've mentioned this in a few different passages. As a Christian reading this, and I want to clarify that that's how I'm reading this, because I'm not reading this as a modern Jew, because I'm not Jewish. I'm not reading this as a scholar of the Jewish Torah or the laws or any of the books of the Old Testament within their Jewish context. I'm simply looking at them through the lens of a Christian who's trained to look at it that way. I look at them through a Christian understanding of who God is, which is the source of all that is good and all that is love in the world. And I look at something like this and I say, there's a lot of non-loving conclusions that I can draw from this, that God is capricious, that God is evil, that God is kind of okay with child sacrifice and burning children alive and stuff like that. All of those conclusions can be drawn from the text. But I start from my core assumption, which is the God I know through Christ Jesus is inherently good, the source of all that is good and true in the world. Therefore, those interpretations must mean I'm making a mistake in understanding it. So I need to look for the interpretation that aligns with who I am taught that God is. And I truly believe that those interpretations remain within me. And the interpretation that I fall to then is that God was testing Isaac through this, that God was allowing Abraham to make bad choices again until such a time as those bad choices could no longer be tolerated. That God was giving free reign. And then in the end, God stepped in and said, no, this has to stop. This line needs to continue, and you're about to truncate it, and that won't work. Do I know fully how that's good? No, I'm a linear human. I'm not even a Ben Sisko. I'm just a dude. I can't understand non-linear perspectives very well. But I have a certain amount of faith that the truth of it is somewhere in there. Beyond that, I don't really know. Which I know is getting annoying to hear from me, but yeah, what do you want? I mean, we've got my textbook here. Like looking at the old textbook here, we've got exactly what I was talking about, like the indication that Isaac might have been the sacrifice. The debate over whether Abraham would have actually been able to do it. Like if he had not seen the angel, if he had not listened to the angel, would he have even been able to do it? Let's see. There are contextual pieces that have to do with when this was written down in like the 2nd century, which is like the most ancient interpreters are doing stuff. Like there is so much, like page after page after page of information. Like I mentioned probably about 5 or 6 episodes ago that I was actually going to have to put the book down for a while because most of the chunk of Genesis isn't really addressed in textbooks too much because it's just kind of, it is what it is. But whereas this textbook, which again is one of the best textbooks out there for this, does not address most of what we've covered in the last 5 or 6 episodes, this episode alone, this one thing takes a dozen pages or more out of the textbook. Like there's just so much debate over what the hell is happening here. And not all of it is resolved.
Excuse me. I'm having a hard time with my throat.
Where the text that I have tends to settle is that the story is about the balance between Abraham's willingness to carry out any of God's commands to the extreme, but at the same time, God's unwillingness to let Abraham go through with these extreme commands that he might be interpreting. And
It just, it's game playing. Like, it seems so capricious and like.
And so, you know where I end up with this? I consider this passage very much like, and listeners on the podcast, be prepared for one of those pauses where she rolls her eyes. It's coming up in about 3 seconds. I consider this not unlike a very good episode of Star Trek. And those episodes are the ones that you get to the end of, and you don't have a clear moral understanding of what was the right course of action here, what was the wrong course of action. You're presented with a situation that makes you think about it. Because the question that's presented from this passage is way more important than any historical conclusions that can be drawn, which is, what would you do if God gave you a assignment that went against everything you know about God? How would you respond to that? If God told you to kill your kid, what would you do? And if God had your kid in on that and your kid was game with it, how would your kid handle it? Like these sorts of
story that also seems to bear the caveat that God will not ask you to do something that is morally wrong.
That's the ending, is Abraham
Okay.
wrestles with it.
That makes it make a lot more sense. And like, why is this here? What are we supposed to learn from this? That's
Right.
something worth learning.
And we wrestle back and forth with this. We knock it around in a bunch of different ways. And what we're doing in this episode is exactly what we're meant to do with this passage, to bat it around like a cat with a chew toy full of catnip, to look at it from different angles. This is literally the inspiration for critical thinking given to us in the Bible. We are meant to question this. Anybody who reads this passage and doesn't question what the hell is wrong with God in this moment isn't reading it correctly. You're supposed to. You're supposed to question God. You're supposed to question Abraham. You're supposed to question Isaac. You're supposed
to question God, the theme of our podcast.
Back to basics. You're supposed to question God. Seriously. I mean, but that is it. Like, this here is meant to present you with the oldest form of the could God create a boulder so big that God couldn't lift it question.
I always preferred could God microwave a burrito so hot that even he couldn't eat it.
Oh yeah, there's a million variations of it, and this is the original. Like, could God create a morally justifiable situation that was so amoral that you couldn't actually justify it?
Yeah,
this is exactly it. It's as much thought experiment as actual historical account. I don't know that this is historical because we don't know that anything from this time period is truly historical in a modern sense or not.
Well, and spoiler alert, the Bible's going to go on to, on repeated occasions, talk about how, like, this sort of sacrifice is wrong.
Yeah, like,
and is done by people that God does not approve of.
Exactly. And so right here we have a fundamentally amoral thing being supposedly proffered by God, and how Abraham wrestles with that, and how Isaac wrestles with that, and how we, the reader, wrestle with that are important. But in the end, God intervenes to say, okay, enough is enough. Love is where is the final word. Obviously, you're not going to kill your kid. I don't care how you come out of this Kobayashi Maru scenario, you're not coming out of it with a dead child. And that is the important figure here. I think that is the hope of this thing, is that it is meant as an intellectual exercise. It's meant to wrestle with. But in the end, God speaks last, and God says, no, this is the way it is meant to be, is not the kid. This is not meant to end in violence. This is not meant to end in pain and suffering. And all of the painful conversations and stuff and worry and fear that happened up until this point are irrelevant, because the end of it is hopeful. And right there we have the whole theme of the Bible. Like, the whole theme of Christ Jesus is all of the stuff that leads up to it. It's going to be back and forth. Great and terrible. Great, terrible. It's the whole human experience. But at the end is the hope. Sorry, you got my preaching mode on there for a minute.
No, it's okay. Like I said, I'm having some trouble with my some trouble with my not so much my voice, but just after effects from whatever the heck bug I had last week.
But I think we've pretty well pulled this, unless you have any other questions we want to dig at.
No, I think we've done a quality coverage of this without, retreading the same ground 50 times or spending for it. Because I mean, we could sit, I'm sure there's other stuff we could sit and nitpick, but I feel like there's such a worthwhile like overall idea here that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah.
That's really what's important.
Exactly. And as I mentioned earlier, even in the academic text, there is so much that can still be discussed about this passage. And if you want to be involved in the discussion of this passage, because let me tell you, we haven't stopped conversating about this passage, Discord server, we're still talking about it. I can bet you by the time this is released, we'll probably still be talking about it somewhere. So get in on that thing, yo.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And since it sounds like we're wrapping up, I'm going to cut you off at the pass and go ahead and say like, share, and subscribe.
She beat me to it. Yes, do the thing. Yes,
leave a comment. Tell us what you thought. Tell us what we were wrong about and how we're going to hell. We totally tell us that. We'll definitely read the. I will personally definitely.
Hold on. You mean you're expecting people watching a religious video to have a vested interest in telling us we're wrong about stuff? I can't believe people would have that kind of mentality in the religious community.
No, please do. Your hate literally fuels us. It's good for the algorithm.
There we go.
But apart from that, like genuine desire for conversation and stuff, please cue some stuff up in the comments. I mean, where are you less likely to find quality, religious and philosophical debate than a YouTube comment section?
Eggs.
Be the change you wish to see, folks. Get down there and ask some good questions.
There is a phrase I've never heard. Be the change you want to see in the YouTube comments section. I love it. Warms the cockles of my heart. So with that all said, we got a lot going on. Links to stuff are down in the description. By the time this one comes out, I think we're going to be at or past Christmas. So there's no need for me to tell you about the stuff we're doing on Christmas because it's already come and gone, or near enough to that it doesn't matter. I should probably know our release schedule better, but it is what it is. That being said, I want to wish you all the happiest of holidays, including Christmas, including New Year's, including any non-Christian holidays that happen to pass in between. Because I know there's a lot of non-Christians watching this too. Totally, definitely. That's a thing that people in, say, the Buddhist community have a vested interest in, I'm sure.
Or people who observe multiple things.
Yeah.
A lot of people celebrating Yule.
Yeah. Like my preference for a holiday here is pretty much any holiday in which I can cook myself up a nice feast for everybody to enjoy, because I love cooking me some food. So with that in mind, I'm going to wish you all another happy holidays, and we will see you all on the next episode, whenever that happens to be. And in the next episode, by the way, we are going to be covering, we'll talk real briefly
That's
about
the Genesis 22, right?
Well, it's just a little bit about the children of Nahor, which is a real minor thing. So we'll probably do like a 1 minute little snippet on that. Genesis.
Tack it on at the beginning or something, yeah.
Yeah, and then roll into Genesis chapter 23, which is the death and burial of Sarah, who finally will no longer be able to be traded for sexual favors. We hope.
I was gonna say. Track record again.
Have a good week, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.